Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Berg. I'm the director of the Americas program at CSIS. CSIS is the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and it's always a great honor to be able to host one of these panels at the North Capitol Forum. This one is called I Need a Hero, as you could just hear from that song that was played, Enhancing Security and Trade in North America. We've got a really star-studded panel here, and we've only got 45 minutes to get to the issues, so I'm going to say very little and turn it over to our panelists for some of their opening remarks. But before I do that, I just want to say we're defining security for this panel in a very broad sense. We're defining security in the sense of economic security. We have folks on this panel who will address that issue. And then we're also talking about security in the very hard physical sense, citizen security, border security, and these types of things. We have folks on the panel who will talk about that. So just a word about the way we've defined security. It's very, very broad, and you will hear a broad spectrum of opinions. Immediately to my left is Elaine Dezenski. She's the Senior Director and Head of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, another fantastic think tank in Washington, D.C. Next to her is Jasper Jung. He's the Executive Director of Global Strategic Initiatives for Global Public Policy at GM. Next to him is Carlos Perez Verdilla. He's the representative for Latin America at Altana AI and Head of Strategy at Olom Infrastructure. And last but not least is Alejandro Poré, who is the Vice President of Engagement and Development at the Tec de Monterrey, and in a previous life, the Minister of Governance in the Felipe Calderón years, if I'm not mistaken. So without further ado, I want to give about a minute or so, since we only have 45 minutes for this panel, for each one of our speakers to make small opening remarks on how they see security, and then we'll get into some specific targeted questions. And I'll start with Elaine, who's immediately to my left. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and congratulations to the U.S.-Mexico Foundation for another amazing event. I was here last year for the first time, and in fact, I think Jasper and I were also on the same panel last year on a different topic. It was on ally shoring, but glad to be back to explore some threads around economic security and national security in that intersection. So I would offer that the starting point for the conversation is that it's getting really complicated when we think about this convergence of economic and national security in the framework of North America. But it also presents some incredible opportunities. So I've picked up on this tension, this kind of push-pull between security objectives and trade objectives. It's come up in different conversations up to this point, but to highlight a little bit of that tension, I mean, we have bilateral and trilateral trade at an all-time high, but from a geopolitical perspective, sometimes the relationship feels tenuous. We've had threads of populism over the last 4 to 6 years that have caused some, in my view, some pretty needless friction across North America. We have more recent issues that have come up around the judicial reform questions in Mexico that, from a governance perspective, are pretty challenging. So we might want to dig into that a little bit more. On the US side, issues around the growing influence of cartels, the fentanyl challenge, are certainly complicating the discussion around security. And yet, all the elements are there for North America to thrive, for the trade alliance to become even better, even stronger. And that is the moment that others have talked about at this conference that I would agree with. So we have a bit of an imperative to think about this system and this frame of economic security in a new way, and it's going to take us into some new conversations. And we're going to have to stretch a little bit and probably bend a little bit more to get to an alignment around a North American economic security strategy that obviously includes trade and protection of critical supply chains, but it should also go into questions about critical minerals for North America. How do we secure those reserves? How do we think about our version of protecting both civil and defense supply chains? That's a North American conversation. as is preparing for the next global shock, whether we're talking about another pandemic, hopefully not, or some other global impact that stretches the trade alliance. So I think we're on high alert in terms of solving for all of this, but we're probably going to need some new structures and conversations to get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Elaine. Over to you, Jasper, for some brief opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. And I want to echo Elaine's thanks to the U.S.-Mexico Foundation for hosting this great event. And thank you all for taking the time to come listen to a few words, just in perspectives on security. I think from General Motors' perspective, we really look at, as Elaine said, the convergence of economic and national security. It is complicated, but I think also at the same time, what we're seeing, particularly in the automotive industry, is resilience strategies, whether it's stemmed from COVID, whether it's stemmed from geopolitics, whether it's stemmed from any number of non-market factors that we as a company have to look at going forward. And I think there's sort of a recognition that those resilience strategies really line up and impact how we define security now, not just here in Mexico or the US or Canada, but as a region. I think that's something, and I think for us, we see economic security and expanding that definition as an opportunity to really align with what we are trying to do, not just at GM, but as an automotive industry. We need all three economies to work together to succeed. We need the governments and the industries to work together, both within each country as a domestic policy perspective, but also collaboratively, whether it's across the U.S., Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement and other types of policies that really ensure competitiveness and meaningful investment going forward. I think, for GM, we have spent a lot of time investing in the entire value chain, and each of the three markets here are an incredibly important part of that, right? And so when we say economic security, we think national security is one and the same, because you want to be able to protect that economic investment. You want to do it in a meaningful and sustainable way. You want to create local jobs. You want to impact local communities in a positive way. And that has just as much importance as thinking about how are we protecting, from a traditional national security perspective, the lives and the livelihood of all the citizens in Mexico, US, and Canada across the region. And there's a component to that from the economic standpoint. So, I feel like forums like this are great platforms to really kind of think about, well, how do you bring more suppliers in? How do you bring more of that manufacturing investment in? How do you create that industrial base that not only enhances the local economy, but enhances the livelihoods across any definition of security that you think of? So look forward to discussing a bit more about that as we go forward.
Thanks very much, Jasper. Carlos?
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. I hope we meet your expectations. So I approach the security question sort of first through a lens. My background is in policymaking. At a time a few decades ago when it was all about liberalization, get those trade deals done, integrate North America, specialize in the automotive sector, for example, for Mexico, and just start trading your heart out. I think we can view that now as globalization 1.0, and together with the change to globalization 2.0, now in the private sector, we turn and see where we are, what that openness has brought. And it's not that we weren't prepared for it, but I'm not quite sure that we expected to be here at this point in time with so much integration, but also with some of the big threats and challenges that this brings. So currently I work for an infrastructure firm, so smack in the middle of how do you get those goods across the border. We specialize at Aloma Infrastructure in highways. We are integrated into the Mexican National Highway System, part of the NAFTA corridor. 55% of trade from Mexico to the US still uses highway. And at the same time, my other hat is with a technology company, Altana Technology, which is focused on mapping the global supply chain. So the integration of those two things, the physical points of entry, how you're going to carry goods across the border, how people are going to transport from one airport in one country to the other, together with the tools that are going to make it safer and equilibrate efficiency with security, is globalization 2.0.
Thanks, Carlos. That's terrific. And I'm going to come back to you in the moderated portion of this panel on a couple questions on globalization 2.0. But Alejandro, some opening remarks from you.
Thank you. Thank you to each and every one of the members of the panel. Thanks for being here. I'll give you the most optimistic perspective on security. This forum, of course, is fantastic, but it's also particularly good that it comes at a very timely moment. We have a new administration, as if it were, I don't know, a new season in baseball. There's every opportunity for hope. So I'm going to be as optimistic as possible, but I'm also going to lay out some of the key challenges the administration is going to face from a domestic and also a bilateral perspective in terms of security. The most clear element, and I think that's uncontestable, is the fact that the sitting president, President Sheinbaum, cares about security. She really does care about the outcomes of security and about policymaking broadly speaking, but in particular about how crucial security is an issue, of course, for regional integration and what have you, but in particular for the population in Mexico. I think the fact that she has had experience with the issue, that she had in the government of Mexico City, she had a deliberate strategy that was not necessarily similar to what everybody else was doing or what the federal government was doing, are a number of the indicators that signal a little bit of hope. And I think also the inclusion of her former Secretary of Public Safety in Mexico City as a cabinet member and starting to get some prominence in the cabinet in terms of security issues are all signs that could potentially lead to hope. It's not just that, it's that the challenge is incredibly complex, but also vivid and patent every day in the news media. And it's very different to say we are going to completely change the strategy of the last 30 years than we're going to continue a quote-unquote successful strategy that most everybody would agree that hasn't truly been successful at the federal level. So I'd say the urgency of the problem, her emphasis on certain outcomes, and the quality of some of the people that are around her are going to make a difference. It's also the case that, you know, the renegotiation or updating of the free trade agreement with the United States and Canada is actually going to make a difference. But also even things like, you know, we're going to be hosting the World Cup. Some of these things are going to have a lot of international focus in terms of what needs to be done. The challenges are very clear. We have just passed a couple of constitutional reforms that are only going to make it harder for her to actually deliver effectively some of the things that need to be done. One of them is, you know, after all, the National Guard is going to be a part of the military, and she has emphasized that that doesn't mean that it's going to be militarized. And I think that what that means is that there's going to be greater civilian supervision over the strategies and over some of the controls. And that's going to be, you know, a typical internal policy, politics, bureaucratic politics struggle. It's not going to be an easy one. So that's a big challenge. But I mean, I think she's gearing up for that challenge. And then, of course, the reform to the judicial power at the federal level. I mean, yeah, it's passed, and I think there's no way back. That's going to happen. But the key question is, how is it that we're going to implement that? And that's a significant challenge. But I think it is precisely because of how daunting these challenges seem that she is going to be paying attention to it. And that actually opens up a possibility for certain success because she will care about outcomes. And the population in general, it's just going to be difficult to withstand this kind of environment that we're having, the kinds of challenges that we're having, and just say, oh, no, we are actually doing something different and people are going to be happy about it. So I think to that extent, we have a number of issues. I mean, things could also go very wrong, but you're well aware of how they could go wrong. You have read the newspapers, you have read the analysts, so I'm trying to provide a counter perspective, and I'm willing to listen from you all why I'm wrong.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Let me come right back to you with a quick follow-up question as we open up the moderated portion of this this event. And it's about security and something that you just said, which is that you're hopeful that the new administration will have a better relationship with its North American partners on the question of security in the hard security sense. Because we've seen over the past administration in Mexico how this has become a bilateral source of friction, especially with the United States. But where I start to lose a little bit of hope is when I start to kind of look at some of the statements, and this is my pushback, the reiteration of culpability supposedly for the United States when El Mayo comes to the border. There's this idea that we were involved in somehow, a plane showing up at the border, and some of the violence that's ensued in the intra-cartel violence in Sinaloa state. Then there was yesterday's statement at the Mañanera that there wasn't really much importance about what's going on in Sinaloa. So my question to you is, are you hopeful that security will not be a kind of contaminant in the relationship between the United States and Mexico, in the sense of all of these other objectives that we're trying to accomplish, of course, on economic security and so on? Because at some points in the past administration, it felt as though it was a roadblock. Maybe that's a better way to put it than contaminant.
I think that's a great question, and that's, I think, the one area in which complexity will be very hard to deal with. One needs to understand that there is this elephant in the room with regards to the versions of investigations by the Department of Justice with the financing of previous López Obrador campaigns, and skepticism or suspicion that has been voiced by many about, the special relationship of the previous administration to different DTOs. That is going to be very difficult to handle, and I think what we're looking at is precisely part of a broader internal political strategy of the Sheinbaum administration. They're not going to part ways with the López Obrador administration publicly, because that actually would become the single political objective that they would have to be dealing with. So in order to establish, to be able to, give out these statements that are actually mostly centered towards a domestic audience of one, you have to be able to have someone engaging in the bilateral relationship that is going to be able to say, okay, so what do we do with this thing? What do we do with the other 120 things that we have to actually deal with? Taking into account that it is going to be difficult, regardless of the name and political party of the Mexican president, to convince Mexican officials once again that you can trust partners in the United States effectively and that they will be reliable over the long run. And I think the cases of Cienfuegos, the cases of Garcia Luna, that's going to be difficult to convince even the most committed security officials to bilateral cooperation that this is actually the time to do it. So it's going to take baby steps, and I think it's going to be to demand incredible political talent to do that. But the demand is going to be there, so that's why I'm relatively optimistic.
Thanks, Alejandro. Let's go to Elaine, more on an economic security question. And I'll start with you, Elaine, and I'll offer a chance for both Jasper and Carlos to make comments as well, because I think this is important to the two of you as well. And it's about one of the big topics we have to discuss on this panel, which is the 2026 USMCA review. In 2026, all three countries have to come together and reaffirm their commitment to the USMCA. I think there was an idea, at least in the United States, among some analysts, that this would be harder with one administration than with another potential administration, depending upon how things go in our November election. I think the candidate that people thought was going to be a little bit easier to deal with basically removed all doubt about that with a visit to the United Auto Workers Union in recent weeks by basically saying, is going to be a renegotiation under me, and it's going to be a renegotiation under the other guy. So what do you think we should expect to happen in the mandatory 2026 USMCA review, given what some of the candidates have said on the campaign trail and some of the other things that analysts have talked about with respect to this macro context?
Yeah, it's the multi-billion-dollar question, I think. On the one hand, I think the more we talk about it, the worse it is, because we take what should be a normal process and a review, not a renegotiation, and we cast it in a way that forces it to become something more than a review. So that bothers me a little bit about the conversation. On the other hand, the reality is that there are so many issues that could impact this review process that we have to be realistic that they probably will. So I think there are three pathways. One pathway is it's a review process that probably is, sort of the best case scenario. There's probably some discussion about rules of origin. There's probably some discussion about China, because it's hard not to have a discussion about China. But hopefully we get to a pretty decent outcome, and the review process is, kind of doing what it needs to do. The second pathway is that these, you can call them extraneous issues, although if we're going to take a North American view, we have to think about all the issues in North America, maybe extraneous to the USMCA, but issues around China and fentanyl and others become political footballs, and it opens up that conversation even more, and we might end up with, worst case scenario, something weaker than what we have. The third pathway, and the one we want to avoid at any cost, is that these extraneous issues, particularly around national security, border, dumping of Chinese product, make this conversation fall apart. And there's a move away from the USMCA that would be fundamentally problematic for the North American alliance. So maybe it's better to be honest about, okay, we have some headwinds that are already with us. So what are we going to do to make sure that we get to the best possible outcome given these issues, which are not going away? I think there's a real argument to have a much deeper conversation around some of these key national security problems now. And to try to get some alignment, particularly on the issue of fentanyl. And that, of course, links into organized criminal networks. And there are other aspects of that challenge. But figuring out how we can have a better North American approach. There's really no way, I'm just going to stay on fentanyl for a minute. There's no way to conquer the fentanyl challenge without a North American approach. There's simply no way. We cannot interdict at our ports of entry fast enough or well enough to stop product coming in from the U.S. It's almost impossible to stop the precursor flow coming from China, whether it's coming into the U.S. or more likely Mexico. We can't catch the pills across the border because the border infrastructure really doesn't get us there, and they're too small, and they're coming in via too many different mechanisms. What we could do is follow the money. If we had more North American agreement on getting into the illicit financial flows and stopping the money laundering networks that are pervasive in the US, Canada to some extent, and Mexico. So these are the kinds of conversations that I think we should be having now so that it doesn't become disruptive to what should otherwise be a normal review process.
Thanks very much, Elaine. And I share your conviction about the word review being intentional, right? It's not a renegotiation. But I gave my preface to that question just repeating what candidates have said.
Yeah,
on
absolutely.
The campaign trail. And I understand it's the silly season, right? It's the campaign season.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if maybe Jasper or Carlos, you want to weigh in on this? Or
Yeah, sure. I honestly feel like we should flip this question on you, Ryan, because you've got that fantastic initiative over at CSIS really kind of looking at the USMCA going forward. And listen, we're preaching to the choir here when we talk about the importance of cross-border trade here between the three economies, and the USMCA being an important facilitator of that. You guys at CSIS have some great data. I know Enrique has put out some fantastic information from the U.S.-Mexico Foundation. I'd say, specifically on USMCA, I think it's going to be complicated either way, right? Like as you said, it is silly season. I think you can take what the candidates are saying with some grain of salt, just as they move forward. But I think taking a step back and looking directionally, that the region and Mexico in particular, the U.S.-Mexico relationship is going to be critical, and it's going to be in the spotlight for any policy action that the U.S. really looks at from a security perspective. And again, that's why it's important to think about both economic and national security as one. Because I think, as Elaine alluded to, from a policy toolkit, right, it's not just about the free trade agreement. It's not just about the review in 2026. It's looking at other potential national security levers, tariffs, various trade tools, things like that, that the U.S. will look at and is currently looking at now to really protect the security not just of the U.S. but the region. Our responsibility as the private sector is to really kind of help demonstrate the importance of making sure that there are no unintended consequences of these types of policy actions going forward, right? There's a certain level of nuance when it comes to economic and national security. It's not a blunt force instrument, whether it's the USMCA or any other policy tool going forward. And that takes the engagement and the conversation with everybody in this room to help kind of define that going forward, to help quantify why it's important, but also kind of help draw that line at a certain point. Because, like I said, quite frankly, Mexico is going to be in the spotlight, and we want it in the spotlight for a good reason. Canada as well, and from all the reasons that we're talking about related to security.
Thank you, Jasper. Carlos, you want to weigh in on this?
Just quickly on
please.
USMCA. After one of the inaugural panels yesterday, the one with Eurasia, the question that is probably coming to Mexico is, are you with China or are you with North America? I don't want to make too much of it, but I think there is a real chance that can happen. And it's going to be a repeat, but maybe on steroids, of what we faced in the 90s when the question was, are you with Latin America or are you with North America? And I mean, this is not a very complex analysis, but for Mexico in terms of foreign policy, it's very hard to be in one party. We want to be in all the parties. We want to be in G20, but also with the Rio and the non-aligned. We want to be part of South America, North America, you name it. So if that keeps going the way it looks like it is, because it's a bipartisan issue in the US, I think it is going to land on our table, and it's going to be very hard to digest.
Yeah, that's a great point, Carlos. And just a small anecdote: upon landing in Benito Juarez Airport, the first sign that greets you on your way to the customs hall is in fact an advert for an app to transfer money between Mexico and China. It was noted certainly by many of us. I snapped a photo and sent it back to our team and said, "See, there's a reason we're doing work on China-Mexico relations." Mm-hmm. Carlos, I want to go back to you though, because I want to go to something that's really your strong suit. You talked about globalization 1.0 and globalization 2.0, and one of your hats is working for an AI company. The other is an infrastructure company. Talk to me about how you're thinking about tech in this globalization 2.0 era when it comes to greater security around supply chain issues. I feel like you didn't get a chance to fully unpack that in your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you. So basically there is a race, like we've seen in other tech sectors, to be the preeminent player in mapping out the supply chain. So basically, if you can imagine, a company has a bunch of tier one suppliers. They probably know their tier one suppliers quite well, but those suppliers have other suppliers and so forth. And you can end up, if you're with a large multinational companies, with literally tens of thousands of names. And today, with AI, and I know this has been part of, AI has been mentioned a lot in these panels, but here you have a very specific result of the use of the tool. You can map out the supply chain of pretty much any company in the world. You have a bunch of information that is public. You can take and ingest all that. You can pay for a lot of information from shippers, and then you can also use the information of each individual company to map out their supply chain. So what does this give you? For a company, of course, it gives you a nice picture where you can look at your supply chain, you can look at what your competitors are doing, you can look at resiliency. But if you're from the public sector and you're more interested in security, you can also start really looking at what the flow of goods are from point A to point B, and pretty much in a probabilistic sense, be pretty sure of what's inside the box without having to open it. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but you have a ton of containers coming in from sea to our different ports in North America. Mexico looks at, it opens up about 8% of those containers coming into Manzanillo, Veracruz, et cetera. The US only opens about 2%, inspection of 2% of the containers. I mean, you can bring in an elephant and no one will notice. So I think the paradox in this change to 2.0 is you don't have to imagine the port operator opening up every container. You have to do the work in Washington, in Mexico City, and see what's coming in on that ship, because you're interested in precursors, security, and by the way, I'm talking about containers here, but a lot of these things can now come in through e-commerce, small packages. So Mexico City Airport is home to the big shipping companies. Every single package that comes from abroad into Mexico City airports has to be opened up by the handlers, because they are so afraid that they're going to pass on to customs something that is in their import sheet, and it's really not that, and it should be paying higher taxes. So you need to look at these tools, information, and just really quickly something, because this always comes up. You're dealing with my information. How secure is it? These systems are so powerful now that they are built around something that's called a federated architecture. So every single piece of data that you use, you actually just extract signal from it. You never send out your customers' data for others to see, but you do use the signals that come from that to come about with these probabilistic models.
Terrific, Carlos. Thank you. Let's stick with a question that I want to ask on this panel, because it's right at that nexus between economic security and physical security. And I'll pose this question to Alejandro, but others on the panel should feel free to weigh in. We all want to see greater nearshoring to Mexico. We all want to see supply chains and supply chain movement to Mexico. But one thing that certainly we at CSIS have been looking at as a deterrent to greater supply chain movement is the physical security of goods as they make their way to the border. During the first 5 years of the López Obrador administration, there were something like 85,000 cargo hijackings, right? The roads are insecure. There were something like the equivalent amount of rail hijackings. So that is something that when I certainly speak to companies, they say, well, how safe is my product going to be getting from where I'm going to manufacture it to the southern border? Talk to us about that nexus between FDI, greater supply chain movement, and the physical security of things on the roads, on rail, on all types of transportation to actually get those goods to the U.S. market.
That's undoubtedly one of the greatest challenges that they have. Any government would have that challenge nowadays, and in particular, with the full transition of the National Guard to the military, that's actually going to demand greater coordination efforts and more effective targeted strategies that are also actually agreed to a certain extent with the private sector to make sure that you can at least determine a few certain relatively safer routes. And I think the building of the railroads should make a big difference, but that's not going to take a few years at all. It's actually going to make a difference a lot further down the road. The use of artificial intelligence and all of these types of devices and information is actually going to be helpful. And there's one thing that we need to keep in mind, which is that is an effort that requires both intelligence, but also manpower. It is true that you will actually need, rapid response capacities, surveillance capacities, presence in some of these main roads, whether it be railroads or the, automobiles or for truck routes. The number of people that we have as police officers in Mexico, civilian police officers, has actually declined significantly. Not just because of the number of people that actually went away from the federal police, but it's also become harder for state and municipal governments to recruit police people, and some of them haven't even tried. So I think that is certainly a key issue of concern. It is my hope to a certain extent, but also it would seem to be the case that this is something that the incoming government understands and is gearing up for the challenge. It doesn't mean that we no longer have anyone in the federal police. There used to be about close to 40,000. I think the number is now below 10,000, maybe 6,000 at best. It's a very limited capacity, but at least there will be the effort to say, what are the very specific routes in which we can start making a difference? And yes, if anything, and I'll once again challenge or risk being pushed back by you, I think there's reason to be hopeful simply because of the magnitude of the problem. It's so visible, it's so obvious. Everybody in this table is going to agree with that. We're going to be having to do that. Everybody gearing up for USMCA talks is going to be speaking about that. We better get our act together. And it's actually not that difficult. We have better tools to do it, but it will take a particular force, whether it's from the National Guard or with civilian control from what's left of the federal police. It's going to be hard.
Thanks very much, Alejandro. Elaine, you've indicated you want to get in, and then Jasper, maybe you want to say something as well?
Yeah, I want to jump in on this question. I think it's exactly right around supply chain integrity. I think we have to make the connection between supply chain integrity, the health and viability of the North American alliance, and that this is it's an economic security question. It's not a nice to have. Chain of custody, transparency in data, exchange of data, enforcement, all of this is absolutely foundational to building the kind of supply chains that are going to withstand the test of political dynamics and hopefully take us into new areas, emerging supply chains, new technology, et cetera. But we won't get there unless we have that level of supply chain integrity. And I think that's very much a public-private conversation. Sure, it's about how companies manage that risk, whether you're talking about insider threat and dealing with that risk, trying to mitigate that, chain of custody issues and data and the like. But it's also targeted investment and enforcement coming from the government. So these two things need to happen together, and I think we need to have a North American lens around that. The other point I'll quickly make on this issue of supply chain integrity and resilience and security is that we should be thinking about the border as not a nice to have, but a must have as well. There's no reason why we shouldn't have a 21st century border for the world's strongest trade alliance. It's ridiculous that we don't. It's just ridiculous. And so we're having, the same conversations that we had 20 years ago after 9/11 around what we need to do to strengthen border infrastructure. And it's about immigration, but it's also about the facilitation of goods. And there are solutions that will actually help us solve for both. And we need to get there in a very practical way and very, very quickly.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Jasper, I want to get your voice in on this. And Elaine opened up the issue of border as well. I assume you probably have some thoughts on that.
Yeah,
too.
I've got a few thoughts on that.
Feel free
but
to
I'll try to keep it quick.
opine on both. Yeah.
No, just going back to Alejandro's point, I share his glass half full approach on this. I think when you look at, I think for GM in particular, we have 650 tier one suppliers here in Mexico, located in Mexico. We purchased $29 billion worth of parts, raw materials, components from those suppliers. About half of those are that go into our local manufacturing sites. About half of those go to the US, to Canada, and to support various operations all around the world. So yes, border security, absolutely important. And I think, when you look at the trucks and the ports as well, I just want to come back to Alejandro's point. Absolutely, like the technology, the AI, as Carlos mentioned as well, but there's low-hanging fruit just around, human capital, getting the workforce out there, adding customs agents to the ports, adding, rail capacity and the workforce to support that going forward. And also thinking about, right, I mean, these are real issues for us, quite honestly. I mean, we have trucks we have truck drivers that can't drive certain routes at certain times of day in order to mitigate the risk of the loss of product and that threat, right? So I feel like there's low-hanging fruit in terms of looking at alternate routes, adding workforce, doing that as much as the technology piece. And I think, when it comes to the glass half full optimism I have, right? We have a significant base here. And suppliers want to come here, like particularly across the auto sector. It's an important part of our resilience plan, not just Mexico, but Canada and across the Americas, in terms of de-risking and diversifying our supply base. They still want to come here, even with some of these challenges that are very recognizable to all of us. So I think, as Alejandro said, the demand will be there. The question is, what do we do about it, right? And I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit as well.
Alejandro, you want to get in on this?
I want to add something very briefly because it actually connects something that both Carlos and Elaine mentioned about this in a different perspective. If it comes true, and I think you're right, that Mexico is forced to choose between North America and China, there are at least a couple of issues, and there's probably going to be more, in which it's not going to be so clear-cut. One of them, of course, is the fentanyl trade, in which if you want to have any kind of success, there has to be coordination of policy, there has to be dialogue between Mexico and China and the United States. But the same is true for money laundering, which is something that Elaine was talking about. I mean, the organizations that have become very prominent in money laundering of the drug trade between Mexico and the United States and the world over are probably dominated by people of Chinese origin that are operating simultaneously in Mexico, in the United States, and in Canada. And there's no way we're going to get around that unless we address it in a coordinated fashion. So it only adds to the complexity that these two issues have to deal with.
I want to do a lightning round of closing remarks for each one of our panelists, and dividing it up, it'll be about 30 seconds per person. I realize there's so much we didn't get to. There are other elephants in the room, like judicial reform, that we never even uttered throughout the entire conversation. So I encourage our panelists, as they're doing their lightning round of closing remarks, to maybe reflect on that ever so briefly, on how that might impact their areas of security. And I'll start with you, Elaine, and go down the line once again. Thanks.
So I think we've got a huge opportunity in the next 4 to 6 months to put a North American agenda front and center. New administration coming in, new administration here in Mexico. Now is the time. And there will be pushback against this idea of a North American model. It will come. It's already here, and certainly in certain parts of the Washington conversation. But key to making sure that we have a real North American agenda is the sustained interest and input and pressure from the business community to keep an agenda front and center across all three conversations: Canada, Mexico, and the U.S.
Thanks, Elaine. Jasper?
Echo everything that Elaine said. I just say industry has an important role to play as we talk about security. There's so many layers of it. We touched on various aspects of it. And Ryan, as you said, there's a lot that we didn't. I mean, someone mentioned China with like 2 minutes remaining, and we didn't even get into the judicial reform. So, I mean, we could sit, I think the key thing is we need a strategic plan as a region. And we need the private sector to work with governments to come up with that plan, to kind of map out, when we think about supply chains, when we think about industry, when we think about the growth of that and going forward, how are we going to compete? Like, what are the elements of that plan? Technology, manufacturing, supply chains, What are the areas that we're good at? What are the areas that we need to grow as a region? And then so that we can provide that framework to the governments, work with the governments, whether it's USMCA or any other policies, to kind of help them understand how do you bring that all together. And collaboration is critical, but that's how you get there. We've got to be proactive on that. So,
Thanks very much, Jasper. Carlos?
I'm going to build up on that. I think the agenda, the issues, we have sort of mapped out and mapped again and discussed them. We have the forums. Those forums, the private sector forums, the CEO dialogue, for example, has to take those ideas, that agenda, and run with it and make sure it doesn't get lost in the transition from one administration to the other. There's very capable people in the civil service that have the knowledge of these issues. Of course, they'll have different political heads running the show, but that expertise is there. Let's use it.
Thanks very much, Carlos.
I will only add, I absolutely agree with what you all have said, that in order for that agenda to have any kind of future and be successful from the Mexican perspective and the political reality, we need to realize that it's not going to look like NAFTA. It's not going to look like the Merida Initiative, that there is a new political coalition in Mexico, that it is dominant, hopefully not hegemonic, and within the reality that the current political coalition in Mexico is establishing, we need to make ways for this North American agenda to be effective. And I think there's a way, and I think it's highly complex, but I think the opportunity is certainly there. But if all that comes out of these dialogues is, oh, we should do it the way we did it with NAFTA, or we should do it with the way we did it with the Merida Initiative, and this nostalgia about what integration looked 10, 15, 20 years ago, we're going to be utterly unsuccessful. We need to come up with new ideas that are based on, okay, so how do we make this judicial, original, crazy idea that Mexico has reform, how do we make it work? And how do we deal with the realities of USMCA that we have spoken about, and also the pressures that are going to come from the political agenda on the US side? How do we make them successful and productive? And I think we can, but I think it'll require a slight change of mindset, at least from our side.
On that note of optimism, but also on the note of there's a lot of work to do, and we need to get to doing it. Unfortunately, we need to close this panel. Hopefully, we've covered a lot of ground in the topic of security in just 45 minutes. Elaine Dezenski from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Jasper Young from GM, Carlos Perez Verdia from Altana AI and Alom Infrastructure, and finally Alejandro Poré from the Tec de Monterrey. Thank you very much for being on this panel. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.
Thanks, Ryan.